yet or not yet? Yeah, we are. Okay. Yeah, we're not ready to start yet, but if you want to start talking, we'll be ready by the time you're done. Go ahead. I'll start talking too.
Well, how do I know when it's live?
It says you are.
Okay. Is it okay to go ahead and call a meeting? You guys ready? Okay, we're going to go ahead and call this special presentation of the West Covina City Council meeting to order. We actually only have, from what I can tell, 2 council members here, myself, the Mayor Mike Spence, and we have James Toma, another city council member here. And so there's only going to be 2 of us. There's not going to be any action today, but we're going to talk CalPERS. Before we do that, I wanted to point out that there are some things that the West Covina City Council has already done in regards to CalPERS. One was we've excluded city council members from being able to join CalPERS. That used to be something that city council members used to do. They used to be able to participate in the public employee retirement system, which CalPERS is the California Public Retirement System. Public Employee Retirement System. That's the acronym for CalPERS. They can no longer do that. And in addition to that, we have been doing things, and I don't know if we'll talk about how we prepaid one of our pension payments, so we were able to put the savings of that aside for future pension obligations. And we have, as a council, a majority of us have taken stands on pieces of legislation in regards to CalPERS, especially as part of their investment policy where they divest from various businesses, not based on finances, but based on making people feel good, I guess is the best way to do it. Divestment stuff or other reasons. And so we've done that. So there are some things we have done in CalPERS, but as you'll see from the presentation, there's a lot of things out of our control from either labor agreements, from the state, their investment policies. But it'll give you a good idea of where CalPERS is at in regards to West Covina and in regards to the future CalPERS here. And so with that, I'll turn it over to the city manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Toma, and the rest of the folks here this evening. Thank you very much. My name is Chris Freeland, City Manager here for the City of West Covina. First and foremost, I want to thank the City Council and the community for coming out and putting this item out there for public consumption. A lot of cities are kind of avoiding the whole pension discussion, and here in West Covina, I thought it was very important to be sharing with it. So what you're going to be seeing tonight is actually a presentation that was done previously to the city staff here, as well as the City Council, to kind of share with them the concerns that management has with regards to rising pension costs that are facing not just West Covina, mind you. This is happening statewide. And one of the items I passed out to the members of the public is an article called Stop the Runaway Pension Train. This article was done in the League of California Cities back in October 2017, and it kind of outlines a little bit what you're going to hear today. One of them is, it starts off in the very beginning of the article saying that, pension costs are rising greater in cities than their actual revenues are. And that's the case here in West Covina. This year, our pension costs have risen greater than our sales and property tax combined in our community as far as increases. So when that happens, what happens to our community? And so that's going to be a little bit of a discussion that we're going to have tonight is, that means either, there's going to be cuts that need to be made in the city's budget, new revenues need to offset that, so there's kind of that give and take. So what we want to do tonight is share with you, what the pension program is, and why are we here tonight? So that way we can have it both for those here and those at home who are learning a little bit about pensions for the very first time. So with that, I would say I was going to make the presentation, but I really can't take credit. Judy Lancaster is going to be doing so. She's our financial consultant who's helping out the city during this budget process, budget time. And she and I have had an opportunity to go through the presentation. And with that, I'll turn over to Judy to kind of share with you. And then what we'll plan to do is afterwards, we'll open up some Q&A so the folks can have an opportunity to ask questions about either the presentation or what the future looks like for pensions. And with that, I'll turn over to Judy.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Let's start with why are we here tonight?
There you go.
Okay. Okay, Chris.
No, we
I don't
lost
think
the
it's
cursor?
working. Yeah.
Give me a second. Technical difficulties, just a second. Ta-da.
Right. Okay. So why are we here? We want to discuss CalPERS. We want to discuss rising CalPERS retirement costs and the severe negative financial impact to the city. So these are the topics that we would like to discuss before you tonight, and there's quite a few topics here, so we're going to be going one by one in these bullet points. So let's start first with what is CalPERS. CalPERS really is an acronym for California Public Employees Retirement System. It's the nation's largest pension fund, and it was established in 1932. It's a defined benefit system, meaning that an employee needs to have a minimum service in the system of about 5 years before they can be called to be vested. And being vested means that they will be entitled to collect a monthly payment for life based on a formula. CalPERS employers consist of state agencies, schools, and local public agencies. CalPERS at this time has 1.9 million members. So I am giving you a graphical depiction of how many employers are there in CalPERS. There's about over 2,900 members. One is the state of California. Public agencies like the City of West Covina is considered as a public agency. And there's about 1,500 public agency employers. And in the school districts, there's about 1,300 employers. And if you look at the right side of the screen, which is the members right here, you will see that there's the 1.9 million members. And that's the school district has 38% of it, which is about 700,000 members. State of California is 31%, and public agencies, including us, City of West Covina, is included in this 31%. So all of this 29 plus employers pool our monies together so that it can be invested by CalPERS. And that pooled money is called the Public Employee Retirement Fund, or for an acronym, it's called PERF. So I want you to think about a honeycomb, okay? This honeycomb right here is about the 2,900 employers who are members of CalPERS. And each one of this are either public agencies or school districts. And let's say this is West Covina. And so each of the cell, West Covina, has its own independent pool with our own funded level. So here's the honeycomb where the PERF is, and this is the cell where we are, and this is West Covina. West Covina has two plans, the miscellaneous, which is non-safety employees, and safety employees. So that's a little background of what is PERS. So how do CalPERS pensions work? So I'd like you to picture a three-legged stool, because really we'd like to talk about a shared responsibilities between these three factors right here. So one of the leg is the employer, the other leg is the employee, and the other leg is CalPERS. And this right here is where the invested monies are. Remember what I did at the previous slide. So this is the investment earnings. They have what they call a discount rate, which is kind of like a fancy term of kind of like just like a rate of return on the investment, is what they call a discount rate. So every year, they would do an estimation of what the discount rate would be on the investments that we have with them. And based on that discount rate, they will then calculate how much contributions the employer is required to give to CalPERS and what the employee contribution should be, the obligation. And if all of these three work harmoniously and perfectly, then you will have funding for pension. However, the problem that's happening right now is right here. The discount rate that they're saying is their target is underperforming drastically. And when that happens, that gap is then being switched right here in the employer and here in the employee, because this leg here failed to do a perfect performance. These two legs here have contributed what is obligated, what CalPERS have said, you need to pay this. And the City of West Covina has paid this every year. So let's look at the pension buck. This is for every dollar that a retiree gets, 61 cents comes from the investment earnings, 26 cents come from the employers, and 13 cents come from the members. This is the PERF. This is not really exclusive of West Covina. This is an average. So let's talk about the plans that we have. How do they actually calculate the pension, the retirement paycheck that the retirees get? We have two plans, as I had mentioned. We have miscellaneous, which is the non-safety employees, and we have the public safety employees. In those two plans, we have different formulas. We have a 2.5% at 55 and so on. So the retirement calculation consists of years of service. You multiply that by the formula percentage times the single highest year or the highest years of salary. And when you get that factored in, you will be able to calculate the retirement salary for the retiree. And as you see right here, the factors that impact retirement are age at retirement, incentive pays, and whatever pension formula you actually fall under. So I did like a very simple calculation. An employee who has 30 years of service, who has $60,000 salary in a year, and they fall under the 2% formula percentage, then they will have about $36,000 a year of retirement income. That's how that formula works. So a question is being asked, which is really the most important question: is there enough funding to fund all these pensions? This is the CalPERS view, the honeycomb view that I had mentioned, and the answer is no. Right now, they're only 68% funded, which means for every dollar that a pension is being paid, 68 cents is only funded. And their goal is 100%. Now, if the discount rate or the investment earnings go down further, we are now going to be approaching the 50% danger zone, which will then result into instability of the fund. Now, how does West Covina look? So for the miscellaneous plan, we are 71.4% funded. And for the public safety, 61.8% funded. So there's this gap between the 100% goal and the current goal, right? So you can see that that's the unfunded accrued liability, or UAL as we call it as an acronym. And the difference between that is 28.6% unfunded, and for safety, it's 38.2% unfunded. So remember the three-legged stool? Let's talk about that regarding West Covina. So the city for fiscal year 15-16 contributed for our obligation that was directed by CalPERS. We paid $10.3 million on the city contribution. The employee contribution was $2.3 million. I'm sorry, $10.3 million for the city, and then $2.3 million for the employee. And right now, in our plan, there's about 319 members. And in CalPERS, investment earnings was only $1.3 million. The pension that was paid in fiscal year 15-16 was $27 million for 748 retirees. You see, there's a deficit of $13.1 million. There's the problem. And where does the problem come from? It's right here in the investment earnings. That, by the way, we have no control over. The City of West Covina has no control over how CalPERS invests the money. They are in full control of that. Now, for the total employer contribution payments, that was 15-16. Let's look forward for about 7 years outlook. The miscellaneous employee right now in 16-17, the current year that we're in right now, we pay about 26 cents to every payroll dollar that is paid to an employee. In 24-25, you will see that it will increase to 46 cents to every dollar. That's 7 years outlook and 7 years from now. On the safety, it's 54 cents for every dollar. And in fiscal year 24-25, it'll be 79 cents. Those are huge increases in obligatory contributions calculated by CalPERS. So we're hearing all of these increases. So why are retirement costs increasing? It's primarily because of the downturn in the economy in 2008. And they actually resulted in a 34.75% loss to the fund. And they have yet to rebound from that. And also the increasing cost is, remember the discount rate I told you, which is the fancy term for the rate of return? They're saying that instead of targeting a 7.5% investment earnings, they're now going to take it down to 7%. So as these rates go down, the contribution that is going to be asked from the city and the employees will go up. Because the gap, CalPERS is expecting the city and employees to take care of that gap. Here's a historical review of how the assets and the liabilities are in CalPERS have performed. The light blue is the liabilities, and the darker blue are the assets. As you can see right here, around 2007, the PERF, the honeycomb, was fully funded. But then we come down here in 2007, 2009, where the Great Recession occurred, and the 2008 economic downturn happened, and where they suffered the 34.75% loss on the fund. So as you can see, the assets went really down. The accrued liabilities, still there. And it kept on increasing, it keeps on increasing up to this 17-18. And look at the assets, it hasn't really rebounded yet. And the gap between these two is what we call the unfunded accrued liability. Okay, what are the other factors? We already discussed the UAL. And then CalPERS is also expected to reduce even more the targeted rate of return to 6%. So that would mean an additional increase in retirement costs. And for the last 10 years, the investment returns is only averaging about 5%. Those are some of the factors why retirement costs are increasing. So what is the financial impact to the City of West Covina? This is a very busy slide, so all I want you to take away from this slide is that the cost in 7 years will increase $3.4 million for miscellaneous. And for safety, it will increase to $8.5 million. If you combine those two, for 17-18, you have $13.4 million. In 7 years, it's $25 million. So the total increase in just 7 years is $11.9 million. That is big. So what could be the impact on the City of West Covina's residents and employees? Well, we need to continue looking for new revenues, taxes, fees, charges for services. We need to continue looking for ways to reduce expenditures. We look for new partnerships. Maybe the benefit increases should not include an increase in pension liabilities. And if those things don't happen, reduction in staffing, reduction in employees' retirement benefits, the city and the employees need to pay the difference, and reduction in services to residents and businesses. I'd like to discuss a couple of the major sources of revenue that the city has versus PERS cost. So the two major revenue sources is property tax and sales tax. The blue is the property tax and the orange is sales tax. as you can see, it's not really increasing as much through the years. And PERS cost, as you can see, is increasing quite a bit. So in 1617, the property tax increased by about $863,000. The sales tax decreased by $916. So there actually was a net revenue decrease in 1617. However, right here, the CalPERS obligation increased by almost 2.3%. So as you can see, the two major revenue sources the city has is not keeping up with the increasing pace that the CalPERS is having us obligated to pay them. So in addition to that, what are the other future challenges that the city is facing? Well, we already talked about the sales and property taxes. Cost of increase for doing business. Just because we're here, increases come. Salary increases, contract cost increases, utility cost increases, the fuel, electric, the water, and the unfunded accrued liability, that will not be paid off for at least 30 years. And we also have a retiree medical unfunded accrued liability of about $55.8 million. So, I know it's not all good news what I have just said in the last 15 minutes, but I wanted to let you know too that the CalPERS actuarial valuation report is available on the website if you would like to see it, if you'd like to review it. And there's two plans. One is for the miscellaneous and one is for the safety. And we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. I do want to add a couple more comments before we open up to questions, and then we'll have folks come up here. In the past, we've had comments from folks saying, oh, we don't want to touch retiree pensions or, have them be part of the solution. But as you saw from the chart, they kind of have to be part of that solution. And the reason is think about it. If I'm a police officer or a miscellaneous employee that retires today, I get 100% of my pension, of my salary. But yet, it's only funded at the point percentages that were shared by Judy, whether it be 80% for miscellaneous or what was it, 60, what was the public safety number?
61%.
61%, but they're getting 100% of their pension still. All right. Now, in the private sector, my wife's in the private sector, she has a little bit of a different pension system. It's called a 401k program. If her investments go down, she doesn't make as much in retirement. But yet, in the public sector, that is something that continues. So one of the things that has created issues for public sectors is there's a mandatory increase of 2% per year minimum. Some of the cities have it higher for retirees that they get every year for life. So they retire today, let's say they get $100,000, next year's $102,000, then it goes to $104,000. So those are automatic increases that are part of the retiree. So that's one of the things that's being discussed among cities that says that one of the changes need to be done. There's been a lot of discussions on the pension liabilities here at City Hall. Well, guess what? Just down the street at your school districts, they have CalPERS and CalSTRS. So they have multi-million-dollar liabilities as well. So the system is not just a city issue, it is a city, school district, and other organizations. If you start comparing other cities as far as their pension liabilities, we're in much worse shape as far as unfunded liabilities than you do to our neighbors in Covina, for example. Why? Because they contract out for fire services, for example. So they don't have those pension liabilities or unfunded liabilities that are, for the cities have their own police and fire departments. That is a huge cost, as you saw. Let's see here. The discussion about having employees pay more. There is efforts that have been done here at the City Council already to start having employees pay more into the pension system. There's still a little bit more work to be done on that, and we're working on it. But to think that employees can contribute enough currently to pay for the current employees that are working, plus all the retirees, it just doesn't work out. The numbers don't work out. And in essence, it's all about fairness too. So if you have an employee who's putting a little bit aside now into the CalPERS system, it's supposed to be designed so that when that person retires, they are able to get that 100%. Now, remind you, if CalPERS doesn't perform, as it hasn't performed for many years now, that number gets smaller and smaller. And so we are, I mean, even with the numbers of that they're saying for unfunded liabilities moving forward for the next 30 years, that's again assuming that CalPERS is going to get that discount rate or that rate of return that they've been saying all these years that they're going to be their target. Okay, and so when they don't get that target, it just makes our problems even greater every single year. I do not think that we gave them the overall number. I thought that might be a little bit of a shock or awakening. So you have the actuarial
I do.
handy? Or actually I got a copy.
Actually have it.
Okay.
I'll just get into that slide so they can see visually.
So as Judy mentioned, the actuarials are online, but also we'll make sure that the PowerPoint is online as well. So if you go under the city's finance department and under financial reports, the two actuarials for public safety and miscellaneous employees are already up there.
Right. So for here, the 28.6%, that is 42 million. And for the public safety, it's 134 million. So if you add them together, the total of that is $176 million of unfunded obligation.
And that was last year when the report was completed. And so the concern is that we're already expecting, we don't believe CalPERS has got the rate of return this year. And as you saw from the slide, we paid out more than actually was returned. So we would expect that gap to be probably even larger this year. So with that, I'm trying to think, is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, that's it.
All right. So if we want to go ahead and add it up to questions, I'm trying to think what the best way to do this. Well, yeah, I'm trying to think for everybody. Yeah, why don't we go ahead and just have you come to the podium. You can kind of turn back, or if you want to use the wireless microphone, let's come up to the podium. Who want to speak first? Jerry? Go ahead, you should be able to face the crowd, so that way you don't have your back to them.
Disclaimer, I'm a CalPERS retiree, and I have been following some of this for quite some time, and I think he's in the ballpark on what I have read. Now, one of my concerns, and I'm hoping you are doing something politically, the CalPERS board, I may not be 100% correct in my verbiage, okay, but CalPERS investments for a while were going social messaging, so to speak. They weren't being always done for the best investment, but like, for example, let's make a statement, we'll start investing in green or various things to make a social statement, but the return wasn't there. Last year, they voted out one of the board of directors who was a real proponent of that concept and got somebody in with a better investment strategy. I hope cities and all people in your area are really pushing back on the social investments, because it doesn't do anybody any good. That investment in people's money should be done what's good for the people, the system. The system I worked in, you could not use overtime and various things to contribute to your retirement, and I hope that is also being politically addressed, because it should just be the base salary, like your wife doesn't get every single thing on it. The other thing, and this is just a statement from what I've been reading, counties where the cities have contracted, they too, the county retirement systems are taking hits and their costs are going up. They're not as cheap as it once was. Bye.
Jerry, we'll let you pass on to the next person, but Phil, before you speak, let me try and answer a few questions. Overtime is not part of the pension calculation. So, when members of the staff do get overtime, it's not what's called pensionable. But saying that, there are a lot of items that are. And those are some of the things, that cities, the city council have kind of expressed some, comments or concerns about. And so what do I mean by pensionable items? So in the police department, for example, if you have a bachelor's degree, you get a couple % more in pay. If you got a master's degree, you get a higher percentage. If you have longevity pay, you get additional percentages. All those percentages, if you give someone, let's say, a 5% pay increase, it's really not 5%. When you have all these other incentive pays, it's really closer to 8 or whatever % it may be, just on the salary side. But then once you start adding all the costs for the pension on top of that, now that is what's called pensionable. So that is something that our, the city managers have been discussing. Myself, I serve on the League of California Cities City Managers Department, what's called Technical Advisory Group. So we reach out to all the city managers and say, hey, what are areas that we can try to reform? I will say that, be one of the younger people that sits at the table. It's interesting to see some of the folks go, oh, we'll talk about, future generations and needing making changes, or, let's focus on, miscellaneous employees, because, no one wants to take on the real elephant in the room, which is public safety pensions. That is the big cost. And I don't want people to think that, cities or anyone else is really to blame for the issues right now. 3% of 50, when it was first sold to cities had what's called superfunding status. We had more money in the system. We were over 100% funded for the pensions at that time. So CalPERS, when they did the actuarials back then, said, hey, you can do 3% of 50, and you know what? We don't believe, because CalPERS has been doing great on our investments, we don't believe you'll have to make any contributions toward your pensions probably for another 10 years. A few years later, we started making pension contributions. So that has, exacerbated the issue, the situation. So what is the city and the League of California Cities doing? They're putting together a position paper. In there it talks about some reforms. It talks about everything from, looking to see what happens on the state level with what's called the California rule, which says pensions are protected. That's being discussed at the state Supreme Court level right now. That's something that could have big ramifications for the pension system. Specifically, it says, my pension right now is protected at the certain percentage that I have, and you cannot take that percentage away from me. Under the new rule, it might say, you know what, Chris, moving forward, your pension is going to be different. We can't touch what you've had the last 17 years in the system, but for the next 15 years in the system, you're going to have a different pension, regardless of what has been agreed to. Okay, and so that will help reduce that unfunded liability moving forward. That is something that does need to happen. A few years ago in January 2012, is that right, PEPRA?
Yes.
So January 1st, 2012, it's called PEPRA. The Public Employee Retirement, it was a change to the entire system. It said all new employees coming into the pension system were going to be in new formulas. They had to pay more towards their pensions. And it wasn't based on highest year, but highest 3 years of service in the pension. And that will have, a change in the system, but it's not going to be quick enough. They're saying, I think, at least another decade before that's even realized, those changes they made to the system. Now, I'm glad it happened, because it is something that we're seeing here, especially in the city, because we're having a lot of turnover, a lot of new people coming into the system, and new employees here. But we're still a long ways away, as you saw that our pension liabilities are going up by what, $23 million the next 7 years? And yet, if we're lucky, our sales of property taxes are going up $2 million. So 2 times 7 is 14. There's a gap of $10 million right there. And that, as Judy mentioned, that doesn't even include whatever other services we want to do here in the city. So those are the concerns that, not just us, the council's been very involved in it. They have these concerns as well. The problem is that a lot of the work that needs to be done has to happen in Sacramento. We've reached out to our local officials, and when you talk about pension reform, they go, oh, that's what you do on your way out the office. Because it's something that no one wants to touch. No one wants to go against the unions. No one wants to change the pensions. There are some efforts. We will have a couple items on our agenda next week that talks about that. So not next week, on the 17th, we have one item. There's a Senator Morlack down in Orange County who is talking about retirees and that 2% COLA. He is saying that unless the pension formulas are 80% funded, those retirees don't get a 2% COLA. And that does help. And that will help with what's called the actuarial that has that big number, that $177 million. That is something we just can't attain that by ourselves. There is no possible way the city can come up with that kind of money unless CalPERS starts generating. I think what's our ballpark total number that we have invested right now?
I have it.
Wasn't it 225 miscellaneous or something like that?
We have 218 invested in safety.
So-
105 invested in miscellaneous.
Okay, well, I guess you could do the reverse numbers of the amount that's funded. So go ahead and say those out loud so everyone heard you.
Oh.
Gotta get you again. You didn't have your microphone on.
All right. So for miscellaneous, it's $105 million. And for the safety, it's $218 million in the system that they're investing on our behalf.
So there's about $300 million in the bank. We still have that $177 million liability on top of that. So it's a huge gap to fill. All right, so with that, all right, Phil, now you can have your chance.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I was just wondering about the discrepancy in the figures between the miscellaneous and public safety funds, especially with the returns. Are there different regulations in the types of investments? And would it make sense if one is doing so much better than the other to erase those distinctions so they all get the benefit of a better return?
So let's talk about a couple of things then. All the money is pooled into one big pool and invested by CalPERS. This is one of the things I did not respond to that Jerry brought up is the CalPERS board. So what has happened that she alluded to is that the state legislature has actually passed legislation to tell CalPERS board what they can not invest in, I guess. Not that what they can, but what they cannot. And so CalPERS has been said, okay, for example, I think there was, what's considered socially responsible, thank you for that. Whether it may be investment in, guns, investment into oil, certain projects that were done. There was the oil pipeline investments, things like that, California's taking a social position that they don't want to have their funds going towards funding. Those are some of the things that have been invested, that have not been invested in, that have high rate of returns. On the discrepancy is really because of the amount of the pension. And what I mean by that is public safety retired at a much higher salary than miscellaneous employees. Okay, so you have folks that are all, at the time of retirement, they're probably all making well over $100,000 a year in retirement. Whereas miscellaneous employees are much lesser than that. Because miscellaneous employees include everyone from admin assistants to maintenance workers who don't have that kind of compensation. So that's where the big discrepancy is. But not to mention the formula is much, much different. Because remember, they get retired at 50. Okay, not 55 or 60 like some of the miscellaneous employees are doing now too. So there's that gap as well. And again, it goes back to what Judy was saying about the actuarial. As people live longer, they're paying out more. So if you're still working, let's say I have to work till 55 before I qualify for a pension. That means 5 more years of me paying to the system rather than me receiving. All right. Another issue that we're running into that we kind of alluded to is they're finding out that there's less people going into the system because cities are having tight budgets. So what do you do when you have tight budgets? You reduce your staffing. Well, when you reduce your staffing, that means you're putting less money into the system. So less money means, and there's still the same amount of money going out or more as people retire, that I think they're projecting in the next few years, there's going to be a point where there's going to be 2 people for every 1 person receiving a pension, it's a half of a person paying into it. So that's the other issues too, is we're seeing that reduction in investment into the investment from employees too.
There was another slide up there that made it look like the percentage of return was very different between the two. And I was really concerned about whether or not there was a difference in the types of investments between the 2 pools. So basically, it has to do with the people and the salaries going into it rather than the types of investments that are being made.
Sure, we'll bring that up. Is it one of the ones with the step stool, the legs, or was it a different slide? Which slide? Do you remember what it looked like?
Let's see which one.
Is this one? Is it that?
No, there was a different one.
Keep going.
This one?
No.
No?
I'm sorry, but there was one there, just show the difference between the investment return between the two funds. And it appeared to me, the way I looked at that, seeing it for the first time, that it had to do with the rate of return on the actual investment, that there's maybe a higher percentage of return in investment in one as opposed to the other, not really dependent on the amount of funds coming in, but really the rate of return.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was, maybe it was misunderstood, because I don't believe there was anything talking about investment returns. I think it's how, is a difference of how much is being paid into for each one. Those are different for both employee, employer, so that may be the difference there. And the amount of return, because each of them, remind you, they do have different amounts of money in the pool, so maybe that's where the difference is.
Okay, so the basic issue then, and if I understand everything that you've said so far, is that the same types of investments are made for both pools.
That's correct.
And there aren't any regulations that pertain to one as opposed to the other that might reduce or increase one over the other.
No, right. And I think what you may have seen is that the pension, or the public safety pension system has more money in it. So if it's getting the same amount of return as the miscellaneous, because it has more money invested right now, that you'll see a higher dollar amount, but not necessarily a higher rate of return.
Okay.
I want to start out by thanking you for holding the meeting and giving us an opportunity to understand, the issue in front of the city. But I do have some questions.
Sure.
So you mentioned, in no particular order, so you made the contrast between the public employee and CalPERS pension versus, in your case, your wife and the private firms using 401k. Is that not an option for the city?
Do you want me to respond to that first, or?
I can go through the
Okay,
whole
go
list
ahead.
if you, the COLA increases that you mentioned, and you indicated that those are mandatory. What makes those mandatory? Is that a negotiated agreement that you have with a certain set of people, or is it something that's been legislated? You mentioned CalPERS board, and I'm not familiar with. Who are they ultimately accountable to? And why are they underperforming and not being held accountable for that? And in the presentation, you had a slide that said, here are the things that we could do. However, in your comments, you've mentioned some others. You've mentioned some things like pursuing legislation, taking on the unions. I think going forward, to have a full conversation about what levers the city has, even if they're unattractive, even if they might be what you might say blue sky, I still think they need to be there. It's helpful if, in fact, the city needs support pursuing legislation. Potentially we have, as voters, some ways to influence that. So I think it would be important to make sure that list of levers. And I don't know if this might be too soon, but ultimately when you look at that just says bankruptcy for the city to me. Maybe that's too doom and gloom, but potentially that should be noted, if in fact, when you really sit back and look at it, that's true, that should be something that should be disclosed, and then ultimately there be some education about what that means. We've seen Detroit go down. We've seen in California, San Bernardino go down. I personally don't know what has happened there, but they certainly portray then a picture so that if we're looking at those ugly levers, people understand the alternate might be worse. So to provide, a full picture of what's potentially possible. But again, thank you for bringing this up. We've seen the reports, but we really need to start digging into it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Before you go, can you remind me the first one, the private versus public comment again?
Yeah, who has, I don't know if the city has to be in
the
CalPERS
401k
because
yeah.
you're a city in California, if you have the choice. And I guess potentially too is, do you have a choice of new employees not having to go in, right? Like you said, you had some changes in contributions, but potentially just a change. I know in my career that happened.
Right.
The pension plan went from a pension to 401K cash and carry.
Understood. So as far as the question of CalPERS, you can get out of the system, but before you do, you have to pay the entire unfunded liability before you can leave.
Got you by the tail.
So they really don't give you an opportunity. But I want to make sure that was
Is
clear.
that for existing employees or
No, no.
even for new employees going forward?
I have to double check. I'm not sure if Judy knows on that one, if you're allowed to have a hybrid. I really think that if you're in the system, you're in the system, you're committed. But I'm not positive on that, but I can double check. But I believe, I see a couple of people in the audience, I see Councilman Warshaw nodding. You believe so? He knows it pretty well too. What's that?
Kim knows.
Oh, Kim knows? Oh, I'll let Kim know. Yeah, or Kim. Yeah, she's helping out the city of San Bernardino a little bit too, so she knows some of the challenges they have.
Yeah, you can't have a hybrid system. If you're in PERS, you are in PERS. Once you get out of PERS, then you can do whatever kind of system you want. But again, you do have to pay the entire liability. There's legislation pending that would change that would allow cities to get out by, I think, Senator Morlock. Not likely to move forward.
Kim, and the 2% COLA, I think that's state statute.
That is a state statute that provides for that.
All right, just a second, let me answer a couple other questions. CalPERS board, it's everything from appointed, I think they may have a couple elected positions, but they are appointed by various folks of the state. So that was kind of takes care of the CalPERS board. They do have their own.
The question was, who are they accountable to for performance? When you're an employee, it's you, right?
To the people that appoint them.
Yeah, it's really to the state legislature in the state of California, because that's who ultimately appoints them.
The governor, I think, appoints 3 or 4 of the members.
Yeah, I think so
I'm
too.
sorry.
Retirees get to vote. We get a ballot, and people the money, and we vote.
Yeah, just so everybody knows, a member of the public was mentioning that, there are 1 or 2 positions that are voted on by the members of the CalPERS system that could run for those positions. Taking on union state legislation, I want to make sure that people understand what we mean by taking on the unions. It's not the local unions, it's the statewide and that effort of the state legislature. I think that this is something that you're going to see eventually people starting to address, but it goes back to your last question, which is bankruptcy. I think you're going to see more and more cities become bankrupt or insolvent, but here's the issue. The liability doesn't go away in bankruptcy. Okay? The bankruptcy really just allows, and I'm sorry, Kim, since you're standing up there, the attorneys to make all the money. Because what happens, it just allows cities to open up their current contracts, both employee contracts and contracts for services. Well, guess what? Most of our employee contracts are open right now, and they're on an annual basis being renewed. So we're doing, and I give the council credit, as much as they can legally under the state to get employees to pay more and more into the system. But again, the issue is not the current employees that are working here, because whatever they contribute still doesn't touch the unfunded liability of the city. But I do believe that there needs to be a push at the state legislature to make some serious reforms, and hopefully sooner than later. I can't remember, it may have been Mr. Grivage that brought up the point, if a bear is chasing you, you don't want to be the last person, or be the first person to get caught by the bear. You want to be way all behind, in front of everybody else. So that they're first to go, which we saw with the city of Loyalton already up north, and here locally with LA Works. CalPERS solution is they went in and actually reduced the pensions of those retirees. And they reduced it to the amount of what was funded in those plans.
Without making resort to there is an actual fund.
Right.
That is supposed to be available for those kinds of shortfalls. They didn't go there.
So what if that was to happen here, what I would envision is CalPERS will look at our funded statuses for both public safety and miscellaneous, and they would say, okay, all miscellaneous employees, your pension, if you're going to get, let's say, 100%, you're going down to 80%. If you're public safety, you thought you were going to get 100%, no, you're going to get your 62%. LA Works in the city of Loyalton up north. LA Works was a JPA here locally with West Covina was a member, Azusa, Glendora, and Covina. And it provided job training for folks here in the San Gabriel Valley. And it was funded through grants and programs through the county. And when the JPA could no longer fund, its operations, it closed its doors. And at the time, when it closed its doors, it did not have 100% funded liability. And so what ended up happening is there was an effort to try and talk to the cities, say, hey, cities, why don't you pay the liabilities of these folks? But JPAs are formed to protect cities from those liabilities. And so the JPA, when it dissolved, that liability went with the JPA.
There is also legislation pending, or trying to be advanced at least, that would reach back behind the JPAs retroactively to get city members of those JPAs to have to fund those. So if that were successful, and assuming that all the legal challenges that I'm sure would come, especially with respect to the retroactivity, if that were a successful effort on the legislator's part, then West Covina would be on the hook for even more liability.
All right, Mr. Rubin.
First, I think I'd like to make a little correction in what was said earlier. I believe that the cities that contract with county are in a similar situation. It's not publicized the same way because it's through a contract, but the county pension system is actually very similar to ours in terms of the unfunded liability problem and the ultimate pension that will have to be paid. So I'll provide you an article on that particular subject, but I don't think that statement was accurate. It doesn't make, what I'm trying to say is it doesn't matter whether you contract with the county or not. All the cities are going to have a problem. I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of this, because I was actually involved when the original legislation came down. It was a negotiation between Gray Davis, the governor at the time, and the prison guards, who were primarily responsible for causing this to happen, because they gave Gray Davis an enormous contribution for his election, and this was felt to be payback. I'm just quoting from newspaper articles at the time that were talking about this. I was a member of a school business officers group that went to Sacramento to lobby against it, because we ran the numbers and said we're going to go bankrupt if this gets enacted. And this was school districts who did not have, we had public safety members, but we didn't have a large percentage like cities do. So cities go bankrupt first before school districts, is what I'm trying to say. But we knew we would go bankrupt. And the reason why was something that was mentioned in your presentation, but I don't think it was emphasized enough. The demographics of retirement. You're going to end up with way more retirees than actives. And because they're retiring younger, the old formula, you were expected to retire at 65, give or take. The new formula, you retire in your late 50s. That changes the demographics so that you end up with way more retirees than actives. There's no way you can pay for that. It can't be sustained. You just eventually run out. Everybody goes bankrupt. It can't be avoided. And so it's just a matter of when, not if. And the point that I'm trying to make is I think that needs to be emphasized in your presentation. The other factor, and you alluded to my bear story. The city can't avoid the bankruptcy, as I already said, but you can't avoid being first. But you have to be very aggressive about it. And I've been kind of dismayed, and I've said so in front of the council several times, that the city is not taking enough action to address this issue. Basically, expenditures need to be reduced, and you need to find ways of improving your revenue. And your best way of doing that is through the business community, because there's not a whole lot to be had in property taxes. So and not to say that you're going to avoid the problem, because you're not. But if a bunch of cities start going bankrupt, the state is going to be forced to do something about this. They're not going to do anything now. And why? Because the people, you refer to the unions, and I don't think people understand exactly what that means, so I'll try to explain it to you. The unions aren't the members. The unions are the leadership. And the leadership all tend to be people about 65 looking at retirement. And I sat across the table from one of these people, and we both retired about the same time. So I know exactly what I'm talking about. When I talked to her about this issue, which is many years ago now, she said, well, my retirement isn't going to be affected by this, and so I want to do it. The state legislature has their own retirement that isn't affected by this. And those guys are all retired now. They're all gone because of term limits. But at the time this was enacted, they all had been in the legislature. There was no term limits then. They'd all been in the legislature 30, 40 years, and they walked out with their full salaries. And so they all had an interest in doing this, knowing that it was going to run out of money. They all knew it because they saw the same numbers I saw. And so there was no interest in changing this. And as long as you have the unions run by these old folks that are going to get the benefit, they're not going to do it. You were referring to yourself being one of the younger people in the room. Those older guys want to get the retirement. The problem is that they aren't going to get it in the long run. All the young folks that are working for the school districts and the cities aren't going to get their retirement. It can't be done because the money's just not there. And I'm speaking, and one of the reasons I'm trying to beat this drum is I'm a PERS retiree, just like Jerry there. And if nobody does anything about it, I'm going to lose my pension at some point in time. And so I'm very concerned about it. Anyway, so the third thing I wanted to mention is that you talked a lot about the problem. And I really think the city needs to engage aggressively in the solution for the city, and that's that bear story. You've got to reduce expenditures and do what you can to improve revenue through the business community. If you don't do that, you're going to be one of the first ones on the list. I saw a list that said you're one of the worst cities in the state. I'm sorry, it said that. I don't have any reason to judge it. It means right now you're going to be one of the first 20 cities to go bankrupt, according to the list I saw. And that's a bad place to be. And that's why I'm telling you have to be aggressive. And the city council had an extended debate on a fire truck. To me, that was a no-brainer. It was an easy way to save a lot of money. And what's the consequence? Not only will you lose the fire truck, you're going to lose 30% of your firemen, 30% of your police officers, and they're going to be laid off. That's what the consequence is if you go bankrupt. I was in a place that went bankrupt, Compton Community College this year. We laid off 30% of the people. It was my job to go in and deal with the shortfall of the money. San Francisco laid off almost all of their adjunct faculty. That just happened a couple of years ago. And I was there when that happened. I was in Oakland when they had to lay off a whole bunch of their people when they were out of money. And my point is that that's going to happen here. What?
Your point is you're bad luck.
No. Well,
Jim,
okay.
I haven't started the 5-minute clock, but I think you've gone over your 5 minutes, by the way.
I know. But my point is that is coming.
Yeah.
And I've mentioned this in the council, but I can't. I wish I could. And the reason I've talked so long is that I don't think people got the message yet.
Right. I want to make sure people understand. I mean, where I do disagree with Jim is the comment that the business community have to make up the difference. And why I'm saying that is, if you look at it, we're already hearing from our property tax consultants. Everyone in this room is pretty much guilty of this, buying stuff from Amazon, I'm sure, or other places. And what's happening is we're seeing property taxes, as you saw on the chart, either go flat or go down rather than increase. Sales tax, I'm sorry, my mistake, yes, sales tax. So if the city is on its property and sales tax can't even make up the difference on the pension liability, where are the rest of the revenues going to come? Not just the expenditures. And, you know, as part of this year's budget, what we're going to be presenting to you in the community as well as the city council is a per capita comparison of West Covina to other cities on expenditures and revenues. Well, income actually doesn't portray in that formula. It's expenditures and revenues. And you'll see the surrounding cities and there are other Southern California cities, a comparison of where the money's going in a sense. All right, go ahead.
Actually, Amazon's a double whammy. They get basically breaks on the mailing of product, and then flip side is the collection of taxes. But up front, they should, if you're a California resident, if it's getting shipped to California, it should automatically add taxes to it.
So it doesn't. What happens is Amazon pays into the state pool or in the county pool for taxes, and we get based on how much sales tax we generate as an entire city compared to other cities. And we get what's called part of that pool. So if Amazon, let's say, generates $1 million in sales tax this month, okay, and West Covina generates 1% of all sales tax in LA County, that means we would get only 1% of that $1 million.
Well, legislation needs to change on that. So a couple of things. If an employee leaves the city and goes to another city, does the pension liability follow them, or are we still liable for part of it? That's one. Second one is, what is the average age of police officers, fire, and then the miscellaneous? And then the third item is sick time. Is that pensionable? And can it go into pension spiking if they accrue it for, let's say, 20 years and then get paid out in the last 3? You know, is there safeguards where they can basically limit how much they can have stored? So let's say if you only have 80 hours stored or 120 hours stored and that's it.
Great questions. Pension liability and moving. What happens is Julie showed you the simple formula of someone who had, let's say, 20 years at 2% at the $60,000 or $36,000 mark. What happens is if people leave our organization, go to another organization, depending what happens on their pension formula may change. Some cities do have different formulas now since the change in what was called PEPR. We said those changes. The city's liability continues. And if, let's see, that employee goes on to another city and makes more money, that additional salary goes back onto the pension liability of the city.
It's where they started?
No, it's on all of the cities that they work at, but that higher dollar amount still is affected by the pension here. It is prorated, but it still has an effect here. So as employees move on to other cities, there is an impact here as well. So, I mean, that's where we try to encourage people, hey, stay here as long as you can, because if we're going to be responsible for that pension liability, we want to have those individuals working here. Average ages of employees?
I have that.
And Judy has that.
Okay, for the safety, it's 39 years old. And for the miscellaneous, it's 45 years old.
Sick time being pensionable. Under CalPERS, you're allowed to apply some sick time, but I believe it's a maximum of, I think I heard 4,000 hours, which is equivalent of 2 years of time. But that's a lot of hours to accumulate over a career in order to get that. But usually what happens is people will leave and they get a few months that gets added onto their pensions when they catch out their at the end of their careers. But there is a little bit of sick time that is applied, or that may be applied, I should say.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. You're doing a great job, by the way. And I don't use Amazon, just so you know. My question is, what percentage of the budget is actually going to CalPERS per year? And how much is that going to increase by year? So in other words, where are we going to be at in 10 years? Are we going to be bankrupt? Or is a utility tax something you can look at? Because we are one of the few cities that have its own police and fire. And at some point, something's got to give. I mean, at some point, something's going to give, but we're going to go belly up.
No, good question. I'm trying to think if we have that readily available.
That slide right here,
All right, so
Brad, you want
for the miscellaneous. This is the increase for the normal cost, and this is.
So 3.4 million in 17-18. What's miscellaneous?
This is for the miscellaneous.
Right, so 3.4.
For the miscellaneous.
And public safety?
In 7 years, and then public safety would be 8.5 in 7 years.
Oh, I'm just looking for the
Increase.
total amount this year, so that's 11 or 9. 10.7.
Oh, right here, 13.4 for everything.
13.4 total right now? So our total pension cost for fiscal year 17-18, the current year, is 13.4 million, which is, I believe, probably about 11 or 12% of the city's budget, which is pretty darn significant. And, you know, I can't predict what the city's budget will be in a decade from now, but if the pension costs are going to double in 7 years, I would imagine that that number will probably be greater because the revenues at this point, based on our current structure, aren't going to keep up with that. You're welcome. Any other questions? For those of you folks that did come in a little bit late, there was a handout, just an article that we had provided to folks if you're interested. If anybody wants to stay after, ask us a couple more questions, we're more than happy to do so. Again, a reminder, the information will be made available on the city's website. The actuarials are already on there. We did not want to put the pension presentation up there yet because we want to present it to you first, but we'll be making that available, if not this weekend, on Monday as well. With that, we want to thank the City Council for having this event, this meeting here for the community. I appreciate everyone coming out and expressing an interest. And this is something that you will be hearing more of as we talk about our upcoming budget, I'm sure. With that, we are adjourned, and thanks again.